Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Daily French Show. I'm going to be your host today. My name is Makone Maja, and I'm joined by two familiar faces to the show, Anlu, Keeve, as well as John Endres. There's John. Hi, John. How goes the battle?
Good. My camera conked out, my connection conked out, just as we were about to start, but they're both back now, so it's perfect timing.
Great. Couldn't be happier about that. Anlu, how about you?
No technical issues, so doing well. Wonderful, thank you.
Oh, very happy to hear that. We have the long format of the show, so happy to avert all technical issues. Let's jump straight into today's stories, starting with the return of the Expropriation Bill. The headline of the story reads, Expropriation Bill will be signed soon. It was Deputy President Paul Mashatile delivering a talk to the National Assembly, saying that the Expropriation Bill will be signed soon and that land reform will proceed under the current constitutional framework as outlined in the Expropriation Bill. The audience may remember that the bill was signed in March and is just now sitting on the president's table awaiting his signature. The deputy president also had this to say, that he did not rule out future amendments to Section 25 of the Constitution that allows for constitution without compensation, but acknowledged the difficulty of passing such amendments and said also that despite pressure from the MK and the EFF parties, land reform will take place. It will be under the current constitutional scheme as expressed in the Expropriation Bill, which allows expropriation without compensation to take place under certain circumstances. John, I'm going to come to you first. We launched a campaign against the Expropriation Bill, and the Institute isn't very litigious, but this is one that we were willing to escalate and approach the courts over. And whilst it hasn't yet been passed, still of great concern that it seems the president will indeed sign it. What do you have to say about these recent developments?
So, yes, you're right. This is quite concerning. The topic of expropriation without compensation is one that the Institute has been working on for a number of years now, having first highlighted risks to property rights as early as 2007, 2008, when our senior colleague Anthea Jeffrey, reading ANC documents, saw the first moves in this direction and highlighted them and sort of addressed them and warned about them. At the time, those warnings were already dismissed, and people said, you've got a strong constitutional protection of property rights, you've got courts that will uphold those protections, so why are you so worried? But as it turns out, of course, the ANC, the EFF, did in fact go through with the threat to property rights and expropriation without compensation, pursuing a two-pronged approach. The one prong was to change the constitution to allow for expropriation without compensation. And the second one was an ordinary piece of legislation called the Expropriation Bill, where they also wanted to introduce expropriation without compensation. The constitutional amendment was defeated in December 2021 because the EFF wouldn't go along with the version proposed by the ANC. The EFF wanted something far more radical, and so in the end they couldn't muster the votes to get a two-thirds majority. So that is currently abandoned, that approach, and the ANC is now pursuing the second prong, which is the Expropriation Bill. And what we saw in this debate in the National Assembly was effectively the left-wing radicals in MK and the EFF trying to use this as a pressure point against the ANC and saying, why have you not introduced this yet? This has been on the president's desk. You've been working on it for 6 years, if not longer, and you need to force this issue. It's very much, I think, what would have been expected of their approach, because this is what they need to do. They need to sort of force the ANC to respond to that left-wing pressure. The ANC, I think Paul Mashatile, in his responses reflected that the constitutional amendment was not going to be easy to do. So he said, we tried, we couldn't get it through. It's tough to get two-thirds of the votes. But if somebody else wants to try, they're welcome. But we're going to go for the normal expropriation bill, and that he indicated that the president was close to signing it. Now, why this really matters is because this is a terrible idea for investment and for economic growth. So, just a few days ago, we heard the finance minister saying that there's lots of debt, there's big deficits, we need economic growth. We've been saying that as well. But you're not going to get it if you don't respect property rights. And that is why the IRR is so adamantly opposed to the notion of expropriation without compensation, why it opposes this bill, and why it will also, if necessary, approach the courts in order to combat it, should it be signed into law. Makone.
Yeah, it's also one that risks, I think of all the risks to the GNU, this may be the greatest one, because for a liberal party like the DA, property rights would be non-negotiable. There is virtually no democracy that can operate without the security of people's rights being guaranteed from expropriation by a government or government entity. Anlu, what's your observation about some of the risks of the expropriation bill and it being passed to the GNU, particularly the DA staying or possibly exiting the GNU over this contentious bill?
I think, firstly, something that we need to keep in mind is that if it does pass and the DA does decide to stay in the GNU, there's also a potential risk for division within the DA, and that might have some influence on, say, the next local election, but also on the federal elections. And I think that's a big risk for them to also keep in mind, because it's, as you say, the moment they start agreeing and conceding on many of these policies, and specifically on property rights, there is certainly a large majority of their supporters at this stage and the voters that will not agree with their decision. And it can definitely start taking away from their vote. And I think it's important what John also said is that we start hearing government talking about economic growth. It's much more prominent now, or at least it's becoming a lot more prominent. And especially in the MTBPS, we heard them saying they want the private sector to get more involved. But we need to say, if that is what you want, if that's what you really want, there's two things that we need from you. Or, well, at least the most important thing for this topic, at least, is we need property rights. We need people to know that if the private sector does get involved in investments, but also just in business in general in South Africa, it's important for them to know that they have whatever they invest in, the assets that they accumulate, it will be theirs. And it is safe for them to actually invest in South Africa. And as long as that is not, as long as it's a potential risk, and as long as it will be a risk, certainly they will not invest. And I think that's the big risk that we face at the moment.
Yeah, we were also quite heartened by the president's response to our letter to him, just bringing some of the issues we had with the expropriation bill to his attention. And not only did we receive one confirmation, but two from the presidency that he will be reviewing some of those issues we were raising. One of them was on the lack of clarity. For example, the bill targets investors directly by saying that people, for example, who hold land solely for benefiting from development around that land, which will obviously increase the value of that land, are targets of the expropriation bill. And just expressing our concern with threatening or placing investors in that position where their investment is being eyed essentially by the government for purposes of expropriation. John, do you have any closing remarks on Anlu's comments about the threats to investment and whether we should expect the president to sign the expropriation bill in its current form, despite the many other clauses we brought to his attention with respect to the lack of clarity?
Yeah, I sort of half suspect that for political reasons he will sign. And the political reason is that he needs to sort of counter the threat from his left. And this is one way of doing that. I would expect that this would then get referred to the clearinghouse, so this mechanism that exists between the ANC and the DA, to discuss contentious pieces of legislation that they can't both agree to. What I'd also like to point out is that, as we see in the chat, and maybe just a comment to the audience, we see your comments, and it's really great to see you interacting with us, with each other. Really cool. With the expropriation bill, sometimes the IRR's position gets misrepresented, and it is said that the IRR is, entirely opposed to the passing of any expropriation legislation, and that's in fact not quite correct. So there's already an existing Expropriation Act that dates to 1975, which is not compliant with our current constitution. So it needs to be updated. There's a need for that, and we recognize that. The current expropriation bill has undergone quite a number of revisions, and some of its worst flaws have been addressed as a result of those revisions. But there still remains quite a long list of things that worry us a lot. And to name just two examples, the role of the courts in expropriation. So we believe that the courts need to be involved in that process from the start, not just after an expropriation has happened, as is the case under the current bill, where after you've been expropriated, if you're unhappy, you can go and complain to the courts. That's not going to work. Like, the courts have to okay every single expropriation before it happens. And another issue would be the question of payment. So if a certain amount of payment of compensation has been agreed, then under the current system, the government could pay that compensation after you've been expropriated. So imagine, you lose your house, your farm, your business premises. The government says we'll pay you because we expropriated you, but then it takes a month, a year, 10 years. And during this time, you're maybe without your main source of generating revenue. So one of the changes we want to see is a commitment or obligation on the state to pay before expropriation, and to say if payment is not transferred within 30 days before, then the expropriation is voided, it lapses. You can't go through with it. And that's just two examples in addition to the nil compensation or the expropriation without compensation clauses, which in themselves are also quite troubling. So yes, I think it deserves a lot of opposition still, and we are going to be there in that fight.
Agreed. So let's move on to the medium-term budget speech, which is a great segue since we're talking all things economic growth and the right conditions that we need to create to enable that growth. First, let's talk the economics of the medium-term budget speech before we discuss the politics of the budget speech. John, you issued a statement on this as well, so I'm very keen to hear what you have to say. On debt and growth, the minister had this to say at a morning briefing with the Rand Merchant Bank he was delivering yesterday, that some of his comments at the medium-term budget speech were misconstrued, that he was specifically raising that South Africa has more of a growth problem than a debt problem. He was saying a growing economy will solve problems of poverty and unemployment, which will increase revenue and simultaneously solve for the debt problem. He also had the following to say, and I quote, "The problem has nothing about debt. Debt is not about its size. It's the capacity of the economy to service the debt." If you are trying to say South Africa must sit at 77%, then I'm guessing 77% debt to GDP ratio, then most of the other countries, particularly in the developing world, are more than 100% debt to GDP, and nobody worries about that. Why? Because those economies have the capacity to service debt. The IR has written extensively about growth. We have a series of papers called the Blueprint for Growth papers, and I'm happy that the author of the very first paper, the pilot paper, is here with us, is John Endres. John, talk to us about this issue of debt and growth. There has been a lot of discussion about whether we should be aiming to have the same debt to GDP ratio as the West, but that the economy, our economy specifically, is not growing enough or is not big enough to accommodate that sort of ratio. Any comments on some of the minister's reflections?
Yeah, I think maybe the first thing to point out is that when you apply for a loan at the bank, they are going to do like a check on you, like a means test. And they'll say, are you able to repay this amount of money that you're applying for? And the answer is either yes or no. And, are you able to service the debt? And it's similar in the case of a country, where the question that lies behind what the finance minister was saying was that same question. He says, we are borrowing lots of money from the rest of the world and from local creditors. 75% is what we're heading towards, maybe 77%. And the question really is, can we repay this? And whether or not we can repay it depends on how strong our economy is. So if you've got a weak economy that's not growing, that's not generating lots of value, then you will not be able to pay your debt. It's as simple as that. And so I thought his clarifications were really useful. It also felt like he was speaking IRR kind of language, making the point it's very basic. If you want to solve unemployment, make the economy grow. If you want to solve poverty, make the economy grow. If you want to be able to afford your debt level, make the economy grow. It's basically the answer to all these questions. What we pointed out in our press release was that our own economic growth forecast is 1.1% for this year, 1.8% for next year. And the global forecast is 3.2% for these 2 years. And so what we did was just do a little projection, assuming that South Africa grows at 1.8%, like every single year into the future, and the rest of the world grows at 3.2% every single year into the future. Then 20 years from now, in the rest of the world, they'll be twice as rich as they are now. They'll be producing twice as much value as they are now. In South Africa, it'll take us 40 years. And why does this matter? Because you'll feel it in your pocket. So imagine like you're a normal person and you could have twice as much money in your pocket while everything costs the same. So this is with inflation taken out of the equation. You're twice as rich with prices the same. Wouldn't that be great? Would you like to wait 40 years for that to happen? Or would you like this to happen in 20 years? If you want 20 years, you need 3.2% growth. Easy. And if you want to make it even faster, then the higher your growth rate, the quicker it happens. And if you hit 7% growth, then within 10 years, you'll be twice as rich as you are now. So I think that single-minded focus is really what we're trying to push the government towards. We use the minister, I think, as our hook to hang this argument on. But I think he understands the argument, he endorses it, and I hope that getting some external support from organizations like the IRR for this message is also going to strengthen his position within the cabinet. So when he sits around with his colleagues and they want to spend money on all sorts of things, if he can keep saying, no, we have to have growth, must have growth first, we've got to have growth, then that's the right message to put out there. Makone.
That's great. So Anlu, you also delivered a briefing, a post-medium-term budget speech briefing on some of the items that the minister was highlighting, such as debt servicing costs. Specifically, remember you hammering on about that point and how it's taking over as a budgetary item, as an expenditure budgetary item. Just share some of your insights with our audience in case they didn't manage to catch that briefing, for which we forgive them.
Makone, if I can just get into I'd like to start with it by just quickly adding something to John's point about 3% growth. And the important thing is, it's perhaps obvious, but in this sense, I think it's important to point out the obvious, is that so if we have 3% or higher growth, we can actually start making a difference to the labor market. And in the sense that the market formalizes a lot more. And what that means is, because it starts formalizing, it starts to affect government's revenue. And in that sense, then it increases the tax base. So more money for government also means that they can actually repay their debt. And that's the thing that I think John was explaining, is that if we're able to repay the debt, there's lots of cases. So if you consider, for example, under Trevor Manuel, Finance Minister Trevor Manuel, we had a 23-24 debt to GDP ratio. But now we've tripled it, and we're sitting at a point where we look back and we say, okay, but what have we done with the money? And we can't actually substantially point out what we've done with it. whether it's build roads, whether it's Gauteng. If Gauteng didn't have a water issue, perhaps that's a good point to at least show, okay, something happened. There's infrastructure, there's economic infrastructure, but we can't point to that. Instead, we point to what we haven't done with it. And in that sense, I think it's important to continue emphasizing why we should focus on economic growth instead of, it doesn't help you focus on the outcome of it. You can't solve the outcome. You need to solve what goes into the problem. And in that sense, which is economic growth. I think an interesting thing that I would like to just point out is, I found it kind of amusing, was that the minister said for the public service wage bill, they'd like to reduce the retirement age. And I understand that there might be an argument in it that can be made, but important to consider is the fact that we're risking all our institutional knowledge. And yes, I do agree there is, as a result of BEE and cadre deployment, we have seen a lot of public servants getting into positions that they really do not have the expertise to be in. But there is also public servants who really do their job and who do it well. And I think we're risking losing many of those people. And instead of actually framing it as creating an opportunity for the youth to enter the labour market, we should consider that there are various other opportunities to involve the youth in the labour market and various other better opportunities that we can capitalise on to decrease the public service wage bill, and to actually get it under control and in a manageable proportion. Yeah, I think those are the two important things. There was various other interesting things that he pointed out, but I think those two are at least what I found, one amusing and one important.
Let's keep you there on the public sector wage bill and bring in our audience a little bit on what you're talking about. You're discussing the Minister of Finance's plan to free up about 2 billion rands of the fiscus revenue expenditure annually by incentivizing early retirement of public servants between the ages of 55 and 59. He says that the proposal would be implemented without a reduction of pension benefits. It would be voluntary, and 11 billion has already been earmarked to encourage this cohort of government employees to take early retirement. This is because South Africa has the third largest public wage sector bill in the world after Iceland and Denmark, which is just staggering figure. I see you are smirking there, John. What do you make of some of Anlu's concern with the loss of institutional knowledge when you're retiring those public servants between the ages, or retiring them early, public servants between the ages of 55 and 59?
So it's a bit hard to make a call on that, because on the one hand, you don't know if you're losing the good ones or the bad ones. You're probably losing the good ones because they'll find another job elsewhere in early retirement if they want to. And another aspect, I think, also is that you might just be shifting your spending from your payroll to your consulting budget. So maybe, that you send people into early retirement, but you need them, and then you bring them back as consultants. So I'm not sure that there's, that much to this idea. Maybe he's going to save 2 billion rand, maybe not. Those 2 billion rand might come back elsewhere and turn into 3 billion, probably. So yeah, that I'm not so sure of the impact of that.
Yeah, that leads us into the conversation about the politics of the medium-term budget speech. We have to discuss the finance minister's comments on how the GNU members are receiving the speech and how he's determined the budget. He said that all GNU members are in congruence with this budget, and that whilst they may dispute heavily on policies such as the NHI, they were united on the medium-term budget speech. But I also wanted to bring in some of the reactions of non-GNU members of parliament from the EFF as well as the MKP. A lot of what I gather from their disgruntlement with the speech was over the lack of planning, that the minister didn't exactly outline how he plans to implement some of these measures that he wants to introduce. Let's take Julius Malema, for example, EFF leader's comments. He rejected the bill, arguing that it was the first neoliberal budget of the GNU, which prioritizes racialized apartheid styles of economic growth. Again, bringing up the lack of plans, but also that there needs to be an urgent address of how we can create employment, develop our infrastructure, reduce the debt, and curb crime. All those items are actually outlined by you, John, in the first paper from the Blueprint for Growth series. So something tells me Malema may be lurking around the IRR website. John, what do you make of this criticism about the neoliberal budget and that it's full of ideas, but it's very shortcoming on plans?
No, so sometimes we do find ourselves agreeing with Mr. Malema. It doesn't happen often. And I'm not sure that our plan to recruit him over to the liberal side is quite working yet. So I think he remains a committed Marxist and very critical of crazy liberal ideas like the ones that we promote. But nonetheless, he touches on some appropriate points. And I think the fact that the budget was a bit short on how to produce growth, he's right about that. Of course, it's not entirely the finance minister's job to do that. So that's sort of a whole of cabinet approach needs to be taken to get the economy growing. And the finance minister, as we saw from the earlier comments, is adding his voice to those calls for growth. So he's on the right side. But he needs support from civil society, from the public, members of the public, from the media, to confirm that he is actually pointing out the right thing. And interesting to hear Malema saying similar things.
Exactly. Anlu, I'm going to give you the closing remarks on this. We have lost non-GNU MP comments from the MKP spokesperson Hlamula Ndlela, expressing discontent with budget cuts to items like healthcare, education, and welfare. He also said that he was very much concerned about the escalating levels of debt. Any comments on that?
Yes, but before, I just quickly want to mention that I can understand why, say, for example, the Democratic Alliance is happy with the MTPPS. There is quite a few big wins. I'm not saying it's because of them, but there is a few things that they have been promoting and that we have seen in the MTPPS, one of which is infrastructure investment. So I can understand in that sense why they are excited or at least in agreement with it. As for the EFF, the MK and the comments, I think the thing that they need to focus on at this stage is what is it that promotes economic growth, because whatever they're looking for, all those things you've listed and that they've listed, that will come from economic growth. So again, instead of focusing on what you want the outcome to be, focus on what you want the outcome to be, but you need to understand that in order to get that, you need to focus on what you need, or on what has to happen, and that is economic growth. So valid comments, but I don't think they have the right idea to get to that stage. It's not by giving extra funding to it.
Cool. Last story for today is going to be about the hearing of the MK party leader, Jacob Zuma, who will be appealing his expulsion from the ANC. Yes, you heard right. He wants to remain leader of the Mkhonto Osizwe party, as well as keeping some of his membership access to the ANC. The story reads that the ANC's National Disciplinary Committee is set to take place this morning. Actually, it'll be virtual, and they will be listening to his appeal, Mr. Zuma's appeal against his expulsion. It says that he was expelled from the ANC in July after he was found guilty of bringing the party into disrepute by forming and campaigning for another political organization. Now, whilst that is forbidden in the ANC, the MK party rules are drawn up quite differently, because their recently published constitution permits their members to have dual membership with different political parties. that tells me that that was done solely for the purposes of allowing Mr. Zuma to keep both memberships. Anlu, let me come to you first. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, my first thought when I heard it was, I wonder whether he gave up or already threw away all his ANC memorabilia and clothing items. And if not, I wonder whether he was wearing it during the Zoom call this morning, because that would have made quite the point. But yeah, I think it's very funny that they even allow, obviously it's for strategic reasons, but I can't understand why, even if MK allows him to be both a member of the ANC and MK, the ANC still doesn't allow it. So in that sense, it won't really make a difference. And I think I can only see how somebody should, well, I hope actually somebody goes and says, listen, I'm from the Democratic Alliance or some other party, and I would also like to be part of MK. Please, can somebody just take the leap of faith?
Perhaps
other than
you
that,
would be
nothing but
willing to do
entertainment.
that. I do wonder if you would be our test case to go and get dual membership with the MK. Well, they've actually said that they see the DA and all other parties in South Africa, or people of different racial backgrounds, as children of the African soil. So I think that'd be consistent, which would obviously be quite funny. But John, let me come to you. Something tells me that Mr. Zuma has a rule of law problem. He seems to have rules that are created especially for him. He gets all the exceptions. He gets passes where others must toe the line. Is this another move of his trying to circumvent and go around the issue of the law applying to everybody except him? Or is he just exercising his right as MK party leader to hold dual membership?
So I think on the one side, this is entirely consistent with the views he has presented throughout his career. And you might remember that when he got judgments against him from the courts, he couldn't understand how this was possible. And he said, but like, those judges aren't elected. And I'm the leader of the majority party. I was elected. So how can they tell me that what I'm doing is wrong? It's impossible. And I think he's just transferring that same idea to within the party. I see the MK constitution was released a few weeks ago. And I think the appointment of leaders is basically at the discretion of the leader. So it's a monarchy, it's a dictatorship, it's an authoritarian organization with him at the top. That's basically it. And with his appeal here to against his suspension or expulsion by the ANC, I think that partly this is driven by sheer delight in tormenting the ANC. So even if this is something that's never going to go anywhere, they're not going to leave him there as a member, but at least he's making them feel bad, and he's making them go through the motions and make it awkward. And that is so much fun. So, I think it's also that he's demonstrating the weakness of the ANC, which is one of his bugbears. He says, like, the ANC is led by this weak man, Cyril Ramaphosa. You can't get anything done. He doesn't impose his authority on the party. Like, he's completely useless. So I'm just going to show them how weak they are by going after them hard. And I'll do it again and again and again, and I'll make them suffer for it. Makone.
I do agree that I think he enjoys making the president sweat a bit over not only his ability to just take a chunk of the ANC vote with him, but also to stay as a member of the ANC. And let me come to you. Close us out on whether you think the ANC will actually do the unthinkable and expel him, which I suspect may cause some division amongst the ANC. They already have so many factions, and we know that there are factions within the ANC that are very much still pro Jacob Zuma. But will the axe actually fall on him? Will he be expelled?
I don't think they have much of a choice. I think they have to. If they don't, it just opens the door for so many other people to do the exact same thing. And I wonder, and I don't have necessarily grounds to say this on, but I wonder whether, to an extent, it might show that Cyril is actually, he might use it as an opportunity to show, but I am a strong man and I won't be stepped on. We'll have to see.
Cool. We've gone well over time, so I'm going to thank our audience for joining us this afternoon. We will be back with weekly episodes of The Daily Friend and The Daily Friend Show next week. Until then, take care.